Hello and welcome to episode number 6 of European UFOs. I'm your host Sebastian, and if you like this episode, then please make sure to subscribe and leave a review. It really helps. The occurrence of complex geometric patterns imprinted onto the crops of agricultural land has, in many countries, become as certain as the seasonal harvest of the crops themselves. Global in scale, one of the many countries where this phenomenon manifests itself is the Netherlands. Here, as elsewhere, some crop circle formations exhibit a range of highly anomalous features that cannot be easily explained in terms of human hoaxes or known natural causes. Ranging from biophysical anomalies to complex and hidden mathematics, these formations have properties that have caught the attention of PhD scientists such as Eltjo Haselhoff. His decades of serious scientific research lead to one unambiguous conclusion: something very strange is going on. Hi Eltjo, great to have you on the podcast. How are you doing?
Good morning, Sebastian, and thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm doing great. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, perhaps a candid admission on my part from the outset. Crop circle research, about which we're going to talk today, has never really been on my radar. And I think part of the reason for that is that I grew up in the late 80s and mid 90s in Ireland and the UK. And I just remember as a kid and teenager being, inundated by documentaries about crop circles, which were always along the lines of, there are some drunk farmers going into the field with a board and, a rope and creating these intricate patterns. And I think that impression, unfortunately, lasted with me for a very long time, which is why I'm very happy to have you here today. And also your book on crop circles has really helped me understand the complexity of this phenomenon. And so this just as a kind of proviso from me from the outset. But before we get into the deepening complexity of crop circles, could you give us an overview of who you are and how you got into crop circle research? Because you're a man of many talents, so it's quite interesting to hear a bit about your background.
Well, yes, I got into crop circles before you were born, if I understand it correctly. And it happened because a colleague of mine, he was from Scotland, and he was probably one of the smartest persons I've ever met, one of these people that know everything and that never forget anything. They learn, and he was kind of my mentor in those days and trying to teach me physics. And he actually mentioned that he saw a documentary on crop circles. He was the first one to introduce me to the phenomenon. And it was the craziest story I'd ever heard, of course, because it was like the circular imprints and bent but not broken and all those kinds of things. And if anyone else would have told me this story, I probably would have laughed and not paid any attention to it. But because it was him and he was the smartest person I knew, I figured, well, if there would be a trivial explanation, he would have come up with it right away. But he didn't. He was sort of puzzled, and he said to me, "You should have seen this documentary. You would have been impressed." And that sentence said by him, by the smartest person I knew, sort of triggered me and got me interested into the phenomenon. And then, luckily enough, within a year or so, we had a crop circle appear in the Netherlands, where I live. And so I decided to go there and pay a visit. And yes, that was actually when I first noticed some very strange and peculiar things about that flattened area of crop, which also this colleague of mine had told me. And for example, in this particular case, it was the fact that it was a huge area of flattened crop, perfectly flattened, by the way, like a carpet, which is something I could not reproduce myself. If I tried to flatten it, it would always sort of jump back and become kind of messy. But at the same time, the soil underneath the flattened crop was perfectly untouched. There was little crumbs of earth that were underneath, and if I walked over this flattened crop, I would crunch them, I would flatten them. And so it was clear to see that nobody had walked on top of this flattened crop. I mean, and that puzzled me very much. And that sort of kept me, made me keep my interest and made me go to the second crop circle that appeared a couple of weeks later. And well, that's how it started. And it continued to go like that. I always found these strange things I couldn't explain. And that's what it keeps you going.
And you have a background in physics, right? So for you, it was even more interesting if you can't reproduce anything in the natural world, I suppose.
It's all about, I think physicists are pretty much about understanding things. And if they don't understand something, it drives them crazy. And they keep on going. And that has happened to me.
Yeah, cool. And so for our general audience who are not familiar with crop circles or perhaps have this impression that they are just, made by students or farmers somewhere in the fields of Wiltshire, could you perhaps from a scientific perspective give an overview of what you are looking for if you go into a newly formed formation? Is there like a checklist or is it more intuitive? What defines a crop circle?
Well, first of all, obviously there are drunken farmers or students and particularly artists, crop circle artists that make these patterns. And we all know that. And I've talked to this person personally. I know them. Even I made crop circles myself. So yes, that happens. And there are some studies out there that try to make an estimate of the percentage. I remember Colin Andrews a while ago said something like 80% would be man-made and the others were then of unknown origin. Others say it's the other way around. I don't think it really matters very much. The fact is, yes, there are artists there. More artists than drunk farmers, by the way. Mm-hmm. These people that create crop circles take their job very seriously, and they can actually be quite good at it. And they see it as almost like a spiritual mission sometimes. It's much more than just a joke to them. That is important.
Okay. Can I just ask you about this? Because I think that's really interesting. So from what I've gathered, you've had some touch points with these individuals. So do they do it, if we were to generalize, do they do that because they feel it's spiritually important just for themselves, or do they do it to kind of proselytize or gain, followers? Do they do it with a public awareness? I'm just trying to understand the motives of doing these, rather big landscape arty things in fields. It's kind of a bit peculiar to me. Why someone would do that?
Yeah, it varies. I mean, this started a long time ago. It started I think even in the 80s already. So that's long before Instagram and Facebook and all the other social platforms that people would sort of try to use today. It varies really. The persons I talked to, some of them were almost like a personal mission or personal interest, or actually seeing how people would react. Some do it for the money, sometimes for publicity or commercials. They create this landscape art. Some say that the farmers pay them so that they can have visitors pay an entrance fee in their crop circles on their land. I don't know if that's true, but it's not. Would be a strange thing. It would make sense. So the reasons are quite different. I think the most important, I never really went into that very deeply. The thing that interested me was that the crop circle makers, who are often presented to the general audience as people that only want to fool others, often have many other reasons. It's not really about fooling others or making a joke. They have a deeper meaning, and it depends on the person. So it depends on it's more than just a joke to them. They take it very seriously.
But do you think...
I think the most important thing is that, yes, we know there are these man-made crop circles. However, the thing that keeps me busy is that I've seen too many times formations that are just too strange to be true. And in general, it is the more simple crop circles. If there's a beautiful pattern of a flower or something, some mandala-like shape, I'm less interested than when there's an ordinary circle in a potato field, for example. This is just one example. I remember one day I was called by a farmer who was very, very anxious, really, and said, "Please come to me, come to my house, come to my land, because last night I saw a flying saucer above my house." And when somebody calls you on a Sunday morning and tells you that story, then it's hard not to hang up. You get out of bed with a cup of coffee. But in this case, I said, okay, well, and then said, there's a circle in my potato field. And I figured, okay, that's a circle in a potato field. It's not the usual wheat. Or said, okay, so I went there. And this guy was very, very scared. He didn't dare to go into that field. He pointed me in that direction, and I'm not going there because, I don't know what happened. And so I went there in that potato field, and indeed there was a large circle. Diameter was about, I think, 10 meters at least, so pretty big, where all the potato plants had fallen over. They were not really flattened, but they were fallen over in a spiral. So there was a spiraling pattern inside this perfectly round circle. And that is strange enough by itself. What was even stranger was that the soil was very soft, so I could see my own footprints very clearly where I'd walked. And there was not a single footprint in that circle. I mean, potato plants are planted pretty far apart, so you could very well see the soil in between. There was not a single footprint. And everywhere I walked, I left an imprint of about an inch. So that was very strange. Whoever did that, if it were a drunk farmer, didn't walk in that field. He was somewhere hanging upside down from a hot air balloon or whatever, I don't know. But it was not, he didn't walk there with boards and ropes. And the second thing that was extremely strange was that I studied those little plants, and it turned out the reason they'd fallen over was because all the stems were dehydrated over a very limited section of the stem. So about a few inches from the soil, there was a little piece in the stems that was completely dehydrated, and the rest of the plant was untouched. And in the dehydrated part that had fallen over, that sort of bent and fell over in a perfect spiral. And if you look at that, then it's, it puzzles you. How did they do this? I mean, the only thing I could think of was that in order to recreate that, if I would have to recreate that, I would have to make a bridge from one side of the field to the other, so that it sort of reach that area without walking there. I would have to hang upside down with a soldering iron or something and touch all those plants one by one to dehydrate them, to burn them, to not even burn them, but carefully, so only dehydrate them, then bend them over and sort of arrange them in a spiraling pattern over a diameter of 10 meter circle. That's ridiculous. I mean, who would ever do such a thing? And how do you do that in one night? I mean, that was not how it was done. That's the only thing I could think of. So, yes, this keeps you awake at night. If you've seen this once, it keeps you awake at night, and you think, how on earth did they do this? How did this happen? And until today, I don't know the answer.
Absolutely. And I mean, as a scientist, we do love a good puzzles. That's always good if you have something to keep you busy and to intrigue you. You mentioned that you're more interested in the relatively simple circular designs. Why is that?
For two reasons. First one is that they are simpler. So it's as long as there are so many answers they cannot give, it's sort of modesty. Let's start with the simple things. Second reason is that in my experience, these simple formations often reveal more of these weird phenomena. If you have the big, beautiful patterns, it's more likely they were created by an artist. Not always, by the way, but it's sort of a filter to make sure you don't drive up there for nothing. And particularly when there are many formations, it's impossible to visit them all, and you have to make kind of a pre-selection. So the modest ones that nobody would go to are often the ones that are more interesting. Also because if it's a real nice one, everybody goes there and they walk around there and they trample and ruin the entire thing before I come. So that's another reason to keep it to the simpler ones. And there's enough to see in these simple formations already.
Oh. And I think if we continue the checklist of what is indicative of, a non-man-made crop circle, if we want to call it like that, although I guess you can never really, in the realm of possibilities, rule out that, perhaps there is.
No.
But anyway, so in reading your book, the deepening and complexity of crop circles, one thing I found really fascinating, well, that's also a bit beyond my non-mathematical mind, is the kind of hidden mathematics in crop circles. And obviously with your background in physics, you were able to dissect that. So is that another feature you would say of these anomalous crop circles, which we can't really explain in human terms?
Well, not necessarily, but it is an extremely interesting aspect, and of course that relates to the non-simple crop circles, because if one circle, there's not much you can say about it that we didn't know already. But it turns out that when there are patterns of multiple circles or more complex shapes, that quite often there are, like you say, these interesting these consistent mathematical relationships between the dimensions of the individual parts of that formation. For example, the ratio of the diameters of the circles, or the position of the circles, or other shapes. In fact, quite early in the 70s, they discovered that there were these sort of consistent almost like guidelines on the distribution of circles and the mutual proportions of the circles. Is something that just came back all the time. I remember there was a book by Colin Andrews, and actually the analysis was done after the circles had been made. So it's not like somebody could have read the book and then sort of try and make the next circles according to this consistency. It had already happened. And it had to do with the mutual proportions between the diameters particularly, and also the position of the circles with respect to each other. And the thing is that it's not something you can see if you just look at it. You have to perform the measurements, and you have to know which ratios you're looking for. And one of the ratios that came back very often, for example, were the same ratios as the frequencies on a musical scale. Like the do, re, mi, fa, sol, and then you have certain frequencies, and they have certain proportions, certain ratios, and the same ratios were found back in the proportions of the circles, which is interesting. And then you wonder, why would somebody do that? And the only reason you can think of is somebody does that, hoping that someone else will discover it and then be stunned. The point is that often the mathematics is so complex that nobody would actually sort of look for these kind of things. So only a few gearheads like myself and some others, mathematicians, sort of go for this, and then they try to explain it to the general audience, and the general audience doesn't really care. What they do, it's even hard to explain to them what you're doing and show that guy's crazy. So it is not really something to seek attention to the mainstream public. It is something else, and of course it could be done by humans just to have a great joke, but it's going to be a very private joke just between them and a few individuals in the world. And interestingly, I found that the artists, so the people that make crop circles, the ones that I spoke to, are not at all interested in this. I mean, they make these patterns for their beauty, and they make it from their heart, and their creativity. And they're not going to make a scientific design or mathematical design, also because often they lack the knowledge of mathematics to do this, and they don't care about it at all. So it is very curious indeed, and quite honestly, I never found a real explanation for it. The only explanation that sort of makes sense is, and which some people give, is that they say this is a form of communication, and whomever makes them tries to sort of reveal knowledge or something they know in terms of other things that we also know, because clearly there's a huge language barrier between us. Which makes sense, that is possible, indeed. But on the other hand, it's all highly speculative, of course. But the fact is, yes, this mathematics is in there. Sometimes it's incredibly complicated. I have found formations that looked like a random distribution of circles and rings. But if you look at them, then it turns out that it's the only shape that fulfills all the criterion that has been published so far. So all those criterion in one formation, it's the only shape that obeys this. And then you get what looks like a random distribution of circles and rings, but it isn't. It's like a one of a kind thing. So yeah, that is quite an interesting and intellectual approach. But on the other hand, like I said, you need a real fanatic to discover this, and at the same time nobody seems to care about it.
I remember when I was doing my research for this episode, going onto YouTube, and because I found it quite interesting with the correlation between music and the mathematics behind crop circles, and listening to kind of musical translation of the crop circle, I don't know, melody or whatever you want to call it, and it sounds very bizarre. Kind of nice, but also very bizarre. That's just on a personal note.
I remember, yes, they actually transformed the patterns into music between quotes. They made a transformer that read a crop circle and produced a sound to it. And yes, I've heard that too. And it indeed sounded, interesting, fascinating. Yeah, there was something not random about it, without doubt. Yes.
So I think you mentioned a very important thing, so that despite these inexplicable and very intriguing findings, there's, not a lot of interest amongst the general public in these formations, even though they do appear regularly, annually, and are just a consistent pattern on a global scale. So why is that? And I'm asking because I have a background in archaeology, and I'm very interested in kind of the material traces as evidence of something that may have happened or may not have happened. So to me, I never really. I think perhaps it goes back to what I said earlier, that the tabloid press has been ridiculing this phenomenon for quite a long time, unjustifiably. So, well, why do you think that there's such a lack of interest amongst the general public for this phenomenon?
Oh, that is an excellent question, and actually it relates to the fact that besides the mathematics and the physics and the biophysics about crop circles, there's also a very interesting psychological aspect to it. I mean, you could write a thesis, PhD thesis on the crop circle psychology. I'm convinced about that the behavior of people and the reaction of people is extremely interesting. And as you pointed out correctly, I think one of the reasons is that, yes, there has been a very active debunking of mainstream media on the phenomenon. They try to ridicule it very much. They have done so for many, many years. And quite honestly, I don't know what the reason was. Some people say that, more like conspiracy thinkers, that it has all been done on purpose and there's the government paying them and so on. I don't know about that. It could be, but on the other hand, I don't know. You can also imagine that people are just uncomfortable being confronted with things they don't understand, and they prefer to sort of make up an explanation rather than accepting the fact that they don't have an explanation. So that sort of drives these reporters to, at the end of the article, come up with a, to them, most plausible solution, which is the drunken farmers or the students and so on. But yes, there has been a very active debunking campaign until today. And even until today, most crop circle stories that are written, if they're written, are always amongst the same lines, you know, the miracles and the mysteries and so on, and biological anomalies. And at the end, there's always, oh, but it was Doug and Dave and they did it. That sort of, and it's always the same structure, almost always. And it has happened to me as well. I mean, to quite extreme cases where, for example, I was doing television interviews where people would ask me questions such as, is this a natural phenomenon? And I would say, well, it's too complex for that. And then they would ask me, do you think it's man-made? Can it be man-made? And I said, yes, of course. You know, it's very well possible. And then when it was broadcast, you heard the reporter ask the question, has this one been man-made? And the answer, no, it's too complex for that. So they deliberately sort of edited, to make me look like a clown. So yeah, they must have very strong reasons to go so far, and I think that is one of the reasons they did a very good job in misleading the general audience, absolutely, and also because the general audience probably is not willing to really dive into this deeply, because if they would sort of take some more time and really sort of try to separate the many stories from the few serious contributions, they would probably figure it out themselves. But most people don't want to take the time for that, and they have other things to do, clearly.
Yeah, and I think that, listeners of this podcast are well aware of that problem, because in UFO studies, we're very much facing the same issue, even if only 1% of all sightings are scientifically interesting. That is still very significant, but amongst the general public, and also due to being ridiculed by the tabloid press, what is a really interesting phenomenon has been debunked for decades and kind of put outside of the realm of scientific inquiries. And that's a really unfortunate situation when researchers can't really focus on a phenomenon out of fear of being ridiculed. That's not a healthy situation. Have you also faced the same sort of criticism or lack of understanding from your colleagues in the scientific community?
Interestingly, well, yes and no. I mean, those in the scientific community who didn't know me have been very, very harsh. I mean, even to the personal point, many attacks which were not even scientific, but just personal. Particularly some skeptic groups, obviously, and they really do everything to burn you down. From the context I have personally, the people I interact with, not very much. No, not at all. I think I've given lectures to audience of radiologists, for example, during a conference, like a leisure lecture in the evening about crop circles, and those were all highly educated people, cardiologists and PhDs in medicine and medical science, and they were very interested. Actually, this book that you're holding in your hand has been proofread by famous American radiologists working in Cleveland Clinic. So I think once people take the time to listen, they want to ridicule the phenomenon, but it's the lack of interest to actually sort of get a little bit more profound knowledge about it that makes people ridicule you, or another reason that I don't know, like these news reporters that edited my interview, for example. I don't know what drove them.
Yeah, it's just really bizarre. I mean, also the other guests I've had on the podcast so far, they are serious scientists. Often they suffer from a lack of funding, which is kind of an ideological problem or political problem, because research into these more arcane but nevertheless interesting subjects obviously doesn't get a lot of funding. So, but nevertheless, their research methods are very rigorous and adhere to all scientific standards. And nevertheless, a lot of their colleagues almost have this ideological agenda of not wanting to hear about it, and that's something I never really understood. And I've read your scientific papers, and they're excellent. And also your book, even though it's aimed at a general audience, is excellent. It has references, adheres to all scientific standards, and so it's just one more brick in the wall of kind of this issue that other scientists are on this ideological quest of not really wanting to hear about what could be potentially an interesting phenomenon. Speaking of your kind of scientific work and research into crop circles, perhaps you could focus a bit more on your series of work articles on the Hoven formation. I'm not sure if I pronounce it correctly.
Yeah, that's close enough. Hoven, yeah, correct. Well, that was a very interesting one, because there had been several accounts of eyewitnesses who claimed that they saw a crop circle appear. And the stories were all very similar. They talked about kind of a wind, about heat, and the crop circle forming in a matter of seconds only. And the latter actually makes perfect sense, because there are many formations that are just too large to be made by people. Just the amount of work only to flatten that area of crop would require like 100 man-hours, and the formation appeared within 2 or 3 hours. So there's no way 30 people could actually go into that field. So, and there had been several eyewitness reports, very similar, and this was another one. But the interesting thing here was that Many of these eyewitnesses mentioned the appearance of balls of light, so little sort of fairy lights sort of flying over the field while the crop circle was made. But this particular person saw these lights where it was standing still. Most of the time they're moving, and this time it was standing still. And that was the only account where the person said that there was a source of light, a little lamp hanging above the field. It was hanging there, it was standing still, and in that moment the crop circle sort of appeared underneath. And he entered the formation and it was warm. He said he could still feel the air trembling with heat, and the ground was warm, everything was warm. And the reason that it was interesting that this light was standing still was because it turned out that it left an imprint in the stems of that particular circle. There was a phenomenon that has been known already, that the nodes in the stems, so the little knuckles, increase in size inside crop circles. And quite honestly, I don't think that is really the case. I think it's more that they shrink less when they dry. But in the end, when you start measuring them, it's the same thing. So you have to sort of harvest or take samples. You let them dry, and then you measure the length of these nodes at various positions inside the crop circles. And it turns out that samples taken from within the flattened area, they have considerably longer nodes than samples taken from outside the crop formation. So that's the control samples. And if I say considerably more, it's like 2 or 3 times longer. So it's not like a small statistical difference. It's really very, very significant. And in this particular case, the very interesting finding was that the distribution of the thickness had exactly the same shape as the heat pattern from a radiation source that was standing still. You know, if you have, for example, a light bulb on the ceiling, then you can see on the floor that the intensity of the light is not the same everywhere, and it's brightest right underneath the light bulb, and then towards the edges of the room it gets less. And that distribution is very well known. You can calculate it very accurately, and the exact distribution depends on the height of that lamp. You know, if you place it very close to the floor, you have a very bright spot right underneath, and it will fall off very quickly. And if the light is higher, if the ceiling is higher in the room, then it will be more uniform, but it will always have a sort of bell-like shape. So that means that from the shape of this intensity curve, if you want, you can make an estimate of the height of that light source. And that is what we did in this case. So we found this perfect symmetry, very interesting. So in the center of the circle, the nodes were, I think, about 2 or 2.5 times larger than the controls, and gradually fell off with perfect symmetry towards the edges. And then I estimated the height of this light, and if I remember well, it was something like 4 meters. 4 meters and 10 centimeters, I think. And interestingly, the eyewitness who was standing 10 or 20 meters away from that circle said it was about that height. And he sort of indicated with his hands, and that very well corresponded to about 4 meters. It was not just above the circle, he said, or not even high up in the sky. It was actually where he pointed at. And that is very, very interesting, because it looks like this node length increase is caused by the radiation intensity of a electromagnetic point source, because the symmetry is exactly that. That had been suggested by others as well, by other researchers, by William Levengood, amongst others, quite earlier. But it was the first time we could make a quantitative analysis that perfectly correlated the distribution pattern of this node length with the intensity pattern of a point source at a certain height above the ground, which corresponded to what this eyewitness said. So I think I published a paper. I don't know. Yes, I had it published in Physiology of Plantarum, I think. There was actually a paper about that sort of explained this and showed this. And in my book, actually, I also showed it in quite some detail. You see all the graphs there. And for me, that was very interesting because first of all, you never find this massive node length increase in the control samples, and also if you flatten the crop by hand, you do get some effects caused by gravitropism and some biological changes, but it's not in this amount. And it certainly doesn't have this symmetry. It will just be the same everywhere. It will not have a symmetry which is corresponding with the imprint in the field. So I thought it was an incredible finding. But of course, there are many others who say, well, this is just the wind, it's just the sun, it's just whatever, it's probably... well, of course it isn't. But, well, I was convinced. But in order to bring it forward, a couple of years later, we decided to reproduce that circle in the same field, on the same crop, same dates, same everything, same sampling times, same protocol. So we could compare. We had one circle that was made by, we don't know who, and which was actually the original one. And one circle made by us with boards and ropes at the same position, at the same place, same time, same season, same everything. And we did exactly the same analysis. And we found that, as expected, no. I mean, there was some node length increase. It was much less. There was no symmetry there. It was sort of a random shape. And which is exactly what you would expect, right? So that's how we show that, no, it is not because there's shadows along the edges of the standing crop. It's not because of the wind blowing differently over the flattened area and so on. There was no biological explanation for this symmetry and for this massive amount of node length increase. And to me, it's a strong indicator that whatever they do to make these crop circles, it does involve heat. It does involve electromagnetic radiation. And speculating, I think it has to do with the fact that if you heat the stems up, they're easier to flex, they're easier to bend. If you just press them down when they're cold, they will snap and they will break. And if you heat them up, they will actually bend more easily because the cellular structure gets sort of so soft. We know it's the same way to build a violin. They make this wood hot so that you can actually bend it, and then it will keep its shape. And the same thing is what you see in these crop circles. So whatever they do, I'm pretty convinced it involves heat, it involves electromagnetic radiation, and then some way with probably wind that flattens the formation.
That would have been my next question.
How do we do that?
Yeah.
So that's the next question, quite honestly. I don't
exactly. Because I found, so the EM radiation and the node lengthening I find very fascinating, but one thing I never really understood is how, or is that causative for the bending already of the of the crops, or is an additional force needed for that apart from the point source?
Yes, absolutely. There must be an additional force that bends them afterwards, and this heating is I think only something to prepare them, to make them weaker, to sort of loosen the molecular or the cellular bonds between the cells so that they bend more easily, and then by what eyewitnesses call wind, they are actually made. And it is something that all eyewitnesses, as far as I know, mentioned. They mentioned the heat, they mentioned the wind, and they also mentioned the balls of light. The interesting thing is that also in the other crop circles, you find this node length increase, but you don't find this very strong symmetry in the shapes because the lights are moving. You can imagine if the lights are moving and they're sort of heating up the field while they're moving, you get an arbitrary pattern of radiation distribution. When they're standing still, you keep this spherical symmetry, which in this one particular case we indeed found, and that's what makes this case so interesting.
Mm. And apart from the node length increase, I believe you also did some very interesting research in the germination patterns from these affected areas. Could you elaborate on that a bit?
Yes, that is actually something that was discovered by a biophysicist named William Levengood, an American scientist. And his interest was particularly because he discovered that the seeds out of crop circles would germinate faster than, sometimes much faster than, the ones which were taken out of the standing crop. And that, of course, is very interesting because if you know why that happens, I mean, they were anomalously fast and they would germinate very, very rapidly. And that is something that all farmers want, because if you throw your seeds on your field and the birds eat it, it's a waste of money. But if you can have something that makes them germinate faster, that is very, very interesting, even also from a commercial point of view. So I think that was what drove him initially to sort of see what happened. But then it turned out it was more complex than that. It turned out that if the crop formations would occur early in the season, so when the seeds were not ripe yet, the germination would be slower. And if they would occur when the crop was ripe, almost, the germination would be faster. So it was indeed some manipulation of the seeds, something that changed them. And depending on the maturity of the seeds, the effect would be different. And I've done the experiment a few times. In my case, and not many times, like 3 or 4 times, I think. And in my case, I found consistently that they germinated much slower. So, and indeed, I was early in the season. That was correct. But it was, again, a very, very clear effect, statistically very, very reliable. The p-values and that stuff. All the scientific and statistical criteria were fulfilled. I mean, there's no doubt about it that this effect was very real. And all the seeds taken from the standing crop were just germinating with the speed that they were supposed to. And all the ones taken from outside the flattened circle were just going much, much slower in my case, or didn't germinate at all. So some damage had taken place to these seeds, very clearly. And it was not mechanical damage, because you could, that's what some people say clearly. If you step on these seeds, you will crunch them and they will not germinate. But that was not the case. I mean, these plants were completely untouched. They were bent over, yes, but the soil was untouched. Nobody walked there. There was no mechanical damage whatsoever. So that was not the explanation. It's something else. And it might very well be this radiation, whatever it is, that sort of that changes the chemical composition of the seeds. That's very well possible.
I guess an implication of all this, which I didn't really think about until I read your book, is that we actually consume crops from crop circles,
Yep.
which is an interesting thought. I mean, you have a nice little anecdote in your book where you say that a mouse in your garage where you were storing that the crops didn't actually touch it. And
that is another thing which was absolutely mind-blowing. I was flabbergasted when I saw that. And the problem with these experiences is that it happens to you, and at that point in time, you are completely convinced. I mean, you need no more proof. I'm just for the listeners. I had taken crop circle samples, and I labeled them all, and I hang them up in my garage to dry them. And then I wanted to perform my germination experiments, and I found that actually the seeds had been eaten by mice, but only the control seeds. And the mice didn't touch any of the crop circle seeds. So there were like 50 bunches of 20 to 30 stems with crop circle, big, pile of straw. And the mice perfectly identified in this huge pile of straw the ones that were taken from the crop circle and the ones that were controlled. So that was remarkable. The problem is that if you tell this to somebody else, to look at you and nod and say, yeah, right. I could take pictures, but they say, well, that doesn't prove anything. It's just a picture of I could have labeled them afterwards. It's frustrating at times because if it happens to you, you don't need, and you cannot have more evidence that something is going on. If you try to convince others, it's almost impossible because it's too weird to be true. Anyway, this is, it is... and it ruined my experiment, of course, because it didn't have anything.
Yeah, that's how it goes sometimes. Yeah. Of all the scientific theories, explanations you've come across and counted so far, which ones would give most credibility to? I mean, for instance, Terence Meaden's idea of plasma vortices, these whirlwinds creating crop circles. Do you think of all the explanations that have been put out there, one is more convincing than the other? You already mentioned this plant physiological phenomenon of gravitropism and so on. To your mind, is anything convincing, or do you think we need to go back to the drawing board and really rethink what is going on?
Yeah, I think the Terence Meaden's explanations are plasma vortices. Yeah, quite honestly, I don't know exactly what it is. It explains some of it, but not everything. And I think that is the problem with most hypotheses. There are some elements that would make sense, but it doesn't tell the complete story. And that is what's lacking at the moment. One consistent theory that explains it all. And quite honestly, I've been into this for many, many years now. And sometimes I have the feeling that the more I think about it, the less I understand about it. So this is really, really very, very complex. So I don't have all the answers. Some say it's alien communication, or that's a very popular one. So it's actually extraterrestrial intelligences trying to communicate with us, which of course is possible. Well, I mean, you can't say that it's impossible because, well, it's. But at the same time, I wonder if there are clear indications that would be the case. Personally, I don't think. I think if there's alien civilizations out there, they have other things to do than communicate with us. That's my personal instinctive feeling. And maybe I'm wrong, but that is what if. And even if they would, then they would probably know a smarter way to do it. And if they wouldn't bother to communicate with us. So, but yeah, I mean, by all means, it is a possibility. But that's also the end of the discussion because it's highly speculative, of course.
Exactly. But looking at the phenomenon as it presents itself from a scientific point of view, I always have the impression that whatever intelligence is accountable for crop circles isn't too bothered what humans think about it, because they do it, in a almost clandestine way. You can only really appreciate the complexity from literally a bird's eye perspective in many cases. And as I said, it often happens in a hidden manner. And it kind of reminds me of the Hessdalen lights in Norway, where you also have these lights flying around in the sky. I've been observed, scientifically studied. I had a research on the podcast talking about this, but there's no indication that it has anything to do with extraterrestrials or that they are particularly bothered about what humankind thinks or does about it. So I find that
I'm completely with you there. I mean, I've compared it to ants, for example. If you are working in your garden and you're pulling weeds or whatever, there are ants walking around there, and you're not going to communicate to those. You're there, but you're not going to try to manifest yourself to those ants, and say, hey. And those ants might have discussions between them saying that, well, I've seen a human. No, you're crazy. Humans don't exist. Yeah, they're huge. They walk on 2 legs. Come on, everybody walks on 6 legs. And you got the same thing. And then they say, well, if humans exist, why don't they reveal themselves to us? Well, because we don't care. We have to pull weeds from a garden. We're not going to try to reveal us to ants. So I think if it's indeed extraterrestrials, it's likely there's something similar to that. We're very anthropocentric, of course. The humans think that they're the single biggest thing in the universe, but clearly we're not.
Yeah, and I think we're kind of delving into a very interesting topic now, which is the meaning of all of it, really. And bearing in mind the scientific findings and that we are pointing towards something that's incredibly complex, we can't really account for. I think that's one situation we just have to write down for now as it is. But, part of the human condition is wanting to make sense of all of this. And my personal impression is that this can only be done on a very kind of personal level. You have a very fascinating chapter in your book where you adopt the perspective of different people you've encountered, or rather report their impression of what crop circles may be and stand for. So this is kind of to bring it back to you, because you've been in these formations. With what kind of feeling do they leave you? This is just a very, on a very subjective level. Have you experienced any sort of feeling that you would only get in crop circles? Because you've been doing this for a very long time, and I suspect that it's not just the kind of scientific conundrum that's behind it, but that's also on a personal level that you have to really figure out what the meaning is, and that leaves you with certain experiential qualities that no other thing probably has. So
well, first of all, I'm a very Western male, unsensitive, scientific person. So I'm not very much into anything that is spiritual. I mean, to a certain point, I'm really entering this thing like an engineer and a scientist. So, and I have not had real, if you would like to call them paranormal experiences as far as I can remember. It is true, though, that when you enter these formations, it is very impressive, very beautiful. I mean, it impresses you. It sort of keeps you. It makes you shut up for a minute, particularly with the better ones. And so, yeah, it's nice. Entering a crop circle is a nice experience. It's a piece of beauty most of the times. And if they're not like this potato circle and other circles and carrot fields and so on, then maybe they're not beautiful, but they have these other things that are so curious that they also make you shut up for a few minutes because you answer. So yeah, it does impress you. They do impress me most of the time. Having said that, I do know many people that have experienced all the strangest feelings and so on, people getting acute headaches, people getting sick and so on, which was very real. On the other hand, you can say, well, that is just, between the ears, so they're sort of fooling themselves, and that doesn't make it a less real experience to them, but it is kind of not caused by the circle, but more by the personal psychology. On the other hand, I've also seen animals, dogs getting sick inside crop circles. And that is a different story. I don't think a dog would understand the complexity. It seems that there are indeed effects in these circles that, or something going on in the circle that affect people on an emotional or spiritual or psychological or even physical level. But personally, I haven't experienced that as much. But again, yeah, sometimes I was really impressed by seeing these things. And what particularly impresses you is that the flatness of the formations. I mean, there's no way, let's put it this way, I've never seen anyone flatten a crop formation as perfectly flat as I've seen them. And what I mean is that if you lie down on the ground and you look over them, you're just from 1 or 2 inches above the soil, you see there's not a single stem sticking out. It's like it's been cut into the it's amazing, and that is really something that impressed me several times.
Yeah. Have you been over the years approached by many people who think they know what crop circles are all about? I'm speaking of people who are kind of spiritually inclined and have their own certain theories of what they might be and not, or?
Oh yes, absolutely. Oh yeah, many of them. There are many people who've told me what they are, and they're convinced, and good for them. But they haven't convinced me. I mean, it's the classical theories like aliens, of course, extraterrestrials preparing us for the return to Earth. It's the gods, it's Mother Gaia, the Earth itself. It's our common awareness that sort of telekinetically creates these shapes on Earth. It's pranksters, clearly. It's the farmers that want to have money. Those are the more basic explanations. But yeah, there are many people knowing that it's the earth people or the sky people or the fire creatures or the demons or the angels. And yeah, many people are convinced that know what it is. But and maybe they're right. I'm not telling they're wrong. But well, they haven't convinced me so far. But that's also probably because I'm a scientist and I want to have some very consistent and simple story that explains it. And I found the consistency so far. I can make a consistent story which is not simple, or a simple story which is not consistent, and I haven't found something that combines both yet. But we'll keep trying.
Indeed. What is interesting there, I'm just looking at chapter 1 of your book, and there's this very interesting figure of the mowing devil from 1687. So, a crop circle from the 17th century, where this artist has also tried to make sense of or attribute a meaning as to what was going on. And here, literally, the devil showing quite nicely doing this, creating this crop circle. So I think this and we haven't really talked about this today, about it's also a historical phenomenon, and this idea or this phenomenon of ascribing meaning to crop circles. It's just something humans have always done, I suppose. I think crop circle research only really took off in the 1970s and 80s, but it's a much more historically saturated.
The Boeing Devil actually is extremely interesting. And that's a story that later has been debunked again by the tabloid press many times with all kinds of, in my opinion, silly arguments. The silliest of them is that in the text somewhere it said that the crop had been cut by the devil, and then the argument is, well, it is not cut, it is flattened, so it was not a crop circle. Well, that's not the point. The thing is that most people that see crop circles today, see pictures of crop circles today, think it's cut. Still, and they see the picture, oh, the crop has been cut. That's what they think. And so what happened back then, and I'm convinced of that, is that these people saw this thing. They also thought it was cut, because that's what everybody still thinks today. And they didn't check. I mean, if they think it's worked by the devil, they're not going to enter that thing. They will run away. They're scared. I mean, this is like 1678. I mean, they're not gonna. The devil was something. Well, it was a big problem in those days to them. So I'm sure they didn't enter it. They didn't check it out. They wrote it first. Maybe later they did. But the interesting thing about the Moan Devil is that if you look at that picture, you see two things. You see the perfect flattening. This artist tried to indicate this perfect flattening of this perfectly aligned. All the stems are exactly the same distances. So this neatness, this perfectness he tried to sort of draw. And also the spiraling pattern. And those are the two first things that strike you even today. When you see a crop circle and you enter that, there's two things that say, wow, it's perfectly flattened as if it was combed. And it's in this nice spiraling pattern. And those are the two things that this artist clearly was trying to express. And that convinces me with close to 100% that this was indeed the same thing that we're seeing today.
Yeah, I mean, it looks uncannily similar. And, granted that there's always a bit of artistic freedom, I think that's probably as close as you get.
It translates the impression that you get today. I mean, it's exactly. Very clear that this guy who drew that saw it. Yeah. It's not that he wasn't telling something that somebody else told. He saw it himself and he drew it there. And this is exactly what, like you said, what do you think, what do you feel when you enter the crop formation? It's exactly what is seen in this picture. The perfect flattening, the neatness, and the spiraling pattern.
Yeah, great, Eltjo. Before we end this episode, I just wanted to kind of briefly, perhaps, ask you to talk a bit about your latest research, because I think you were kind enough to forward it to me, namely Einstein's relativity theory and how you can. In fact, if I understood correctly, make it more simpler through applying Newtonian physics. This isn't really probably the right podcast for it, but I think it's really so fascinating. I mean, not understanding all the mathematics, obviously, but it did quite interest me because it also points to Plato's original idea of the shadow on the wall, and that reality might be actually, or most certainly is more complex than we are able to fathom. So if you could perhaps talk a bit about that.
Yes, absolutely. And actually it does link in a little bit to both crop circles as well as UFOs, I think. There are some connections. I would say that this theory creates a bridge between contemporary physics and UFOs and or crop circles. So it's not completely out of the stream of this discussion. And the how do I tell this in not too many words? See, the point is that the motion of objects, so things moving around us, and I'm talking about horses and cars and falling rocks and apples falling from trees, is something that has been under study forever by people. And even the ancient Greek had their own physical models of how things were moving and how mechanisms work. And they were actually pretty good at it. The ancient Greek thousands of years ago could already make like a gearbox, which allowed them to pull a ship on the beach by just one guy, because they had a mechanism of many gear wheels, which sort of would increase the force of one single person. So they were actually pretty good at it. At the same time, they made many mistakes in the theory as well. And it wasn't until the 17th century when Sir Isaac Newton first really established the modern classical mechanics, as we call it, which is the physics that describes the motion of objects. And so that was quite an accomplishment because it was thousands of years after we already thought we knew how it worked. So it was the 17th century, and that's a theory that we still learn in school today. So that's about a car accelerating and the distance traveled by a car at a certain velocity after a certain time and those kinds of things. And we use that also to launch a rocket and to send a rocket to Mars even. So it's still very, very valid. However, somewhere at the end of the 19th century, some experiments were performed where they discovered that the theory doesn't always work. And it doesn't work when the velocities get very high. And it doesn't work for the speed of light. The speed of light is very, very strange. Usually the velocity of something, the speed of something depends on your own speed as well. Because if you are standing still, then a car that approaches you at 50 miles an hour doesn't approach you as fast as in the case where you are also approaching that car at 50 miles an hour, because then it approaches you at 100 miles an hour, right? So, and that last thing is something that does not apply to the speed of light. They found that the speed of light is always the same regardless of your own motion. And that is something that is very curious if you think about it. And that sort of, it cannot be explained with the classical mechanics. So that's when Einstein came aboard, and Einstein then created his theory of relativity. That's an alternative theory that also describes the motion of objects, but in case the velocities get very high. So currently in the scientific consensus, we have two different models. So one is the classical mechanics, that's for describing motion of objects when they're going slowly. And if they're going very fast, approaching the speed of light, so you need that in particle accelerators and in astronomy sometimes, you use another theory, which is Einstein's theory of relativity. And then you get all kinds of strange things happening. You get these things that you probably know about, that time is slowing down when you're going fast, and the dimensions of objects change when you're going fast, and so on. It's fascinating. Now, I've always had problems with the theory of relativity, because the first time when he told me about it, I was like 16, and I said, no way, that's impossible. That's what everybody would say, by the way, but I sort of insisted even after many years. It didn't feel, I don't know, I always had something with it. And the paper I published a couple of months ago, actually, I think is very interesting, because what it shows you is that, what it suggests, to put it this way, is that our universe, our world that we're seeing, is a four-dimensional universe. So we have four spatial dimensions. And if you look at Einstein's theory of relativity, there are also the four dimensions, but that is like up, down, left, right, and forward, backwards, plus time. So the fourth dimension is time. And in my model, it's four spatial dimensions. So you could measure the length in each four of them. So it's left, right, up, down, forward, backwards, and then there's a fourth one, which we cannot imagine, because we cannot imagine a four-dimensional space. But we only see three dimensions, but that doesn't mean the fourth one isn't there. So why would I assume that? Well, I assume that because it turns out if you create this four-dimensional space mathematically, I mean, you cannot imagine it, but you can calculate in it. We can adapt to mathematics. So we make a four-dimensional space with four spatial dimensions, and we apply the Newtonian mechanics, so the 17th century mechanics, to that four-dimensional space. And then we calculate the projection. So we only take three dimensions out of this four, and we only look at those three. And those three make up a three-dimensional space, which is something that we see around us. It turns out that projection behaves exactly like the theory of relativity of Einstein predicts. So the time dilation, the time going slower, objects changing shape, all those kinds of things can be explained with 17th century mechanics if you assume that the actual universe is four-dimensional and we only see like a three-dimensional shadow of it. And the interesting thing is that it makes relativity much simpler, because it turns out it's just Newton's first law, Newton's second law, F equals m times a, that kind of stuff that we all learn in secondary school, except we're looking at the shadow of the four-dimensional reality in our three-dimensional perception. So the theory becomes much simpler. And in addition, it also eliminates a couple of inconsistencies that there are, in my opinion, in contemporary physics. So we don't need two different models with certain rules and certain exceptions. You just have one model, which is a 17th century physics. It eliminates all the inconsistencies, and it generates exactly the same formulas that you can derive from the theory of relativity, except it only takes you 2 lines of algebra rather than 4 pages. So it's much simpler, much more consistent, I think much more elegant, and it gives you the same results. And that is very interesting, if there's a 4-dimensional universe, and we are only in the 3-dimensional shadow of that, it means there must be 3 other 3-dimensional universes. I mean, we're living in the X, Y, Z, if you want, but there are 4 dimensions, X, Y, Z, and let's call it W. And we live in the XYZ dimension, but it means there's also an XYW dimension and an XZW and a YZW dimension. So those are those other 3-dimensional spaces, which are sort of parallel to ours, if you want. And they're also even touching our own world, but we can't see it. And one of the things that always puzzled me very much in the crop circles and also the UFOs is that these balls of light that contain a lot of energy, enough to heat up an entire crop field, or a UFO, which you can see, which is there, and then it just disappears into nothing. Where does it go to? Well, if it would go into the WYZ dimension, yes, that it would still be there, but I couldn't see it anymore. And the same appears to the balls of light. So, sometimes I speculate that maybe that is why these UFOs are hiding or are going to when they seem to disappear from ours, but they're just going into another shadow, if you know what I mean. They're actually sort of making the jump from one 3-dimensional shadow to another one in our 4-dimensional universe. And somehow they have the technology to do that, and we don't. So this theory not only makes everything much simpler, it also sort of opens up a gateway to give kind of a scientific explanation to what we see when UFOs disappear or when balls of light appear and disappear.
Yeah, thanks for elaborating on this. It's definitely very, very interesting and kind of brings us full circle back to what many eyewitnesses have also reported with credible UFO sightings, that they kind of seem to phase out, jump into our reality, and it's definitely an interesting model to perhaps think about these sorts of phenomena. And what I also find interesting, and relating to crop circle research, your model here presupposes a kind of geometric reality, if understood correctly, and obviously crop circles are inherently geometrically meaningful. So kind of also, to me at least, interesting. Yeah, that is the case.
Yeah, and actually the most fascinating thing personally, I think, is that, and you already mentioned that Plato, I don't know, 3,000 years ago, something already said this. He actually suggested that the world we see around us is a shadow of a more complicated world, and he compared it to the shadow on the wall of a cave, where the people that were inside, they were chained inside that cave to, and they could only see the shadow of the outside world. So he said to them, the world is a 2-dimensional black and white scene, whereas we know it's a 3-dimensional and in color. And then he said, but what we see, 3-dimensional and in color, is actually also only a shadow of a much more complicated universe. And that is exactly what my theory is about. And I knew about this a long time ago, and it has always fascinated me very much. And it was also the inspiration to get to this theory. And now I really puzzled, how did Plato know? Because he was spot on, in my opinion. So did somebody tell him? Did some alien maybe talk to Plato? And how could he figure it out? It's amazing, but this has been like 3,000 years ago. That's what fascinates me most right now.
I think there's no better way to close an episode than with a discussion of Plato. So that's absolutely excellent. I wish that could be the case for every episode. Well, thanks so much, Eltjo. It's been a real pleasure talking about crop circles, physics, and very, very, very intriguing. For our audience, where can they find your work relating to crop circles, but also all the other endeavors you might be up to? Do you have online resources? Where can people find you?
There's one website which is called simplerelativity.info. And that is where I'm currently publishing my latest, we call the simple theory of relativity work. Currently, I don't have a crop circle website anymore. My books most of them I think are out of print. They have been, my latest book has been translated into 5 languages, but you can still find them in secondhand books. They're still available, but not fresh from the press anymore. I am considering writing an update. So if people are really interested, just I would recommend them to stay tuned, because there are some new things, some new developments. And like you said, my latest book has been out there for quite a while, and I think it merits a little update with some adjournments and so on. And if that's the case, I will definitely put it on the internet in such a way that everybody who wants to find it will find it immediately.
Oh, perfect. Thanks a lot, Eltjo. And I'll make sure to link your book and also the website in the blurb of the podcast. Thanks, and hopefully have you again on again soon.
Right. My great pleasure. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.